Hey guys, Constance here. Welcome back to A Good Life Farm. So I have brought you into the kitchen today to do some baking. I am going to make a recipe that I have not made in a really long time. I would estimate, well, I haven't made it since we've lived here at the homestead, so it's been a minute since I made this. But this is a yeast bread recipe. It is a savory yeast bread recipe, and it is filled with Swiss cheese and caramelized onions. It is called Swiss onion bread, and I used to make this pretty frequently back in the day when I had a house full of all the family. But like I said, I haven't made it in quite a while, and I've kind of been craving it, and so that is what we're going to do today. I printed off the recipe from my website. I used to have all of my recipes printed out in big binders, and when one of my kids got married, I let them take my printable or printed versions of all of Mama's recipes with them, and I have just never reprinted all of my recipes. And you know, when my website was down a couple weeks ago, it kind of gave me some heart palpitations, because my website is actually my personal cookbook. When I develop a recipe and all of that, I publish it, and when I'm cooking, I use my own website as my resource for all of my recipes. And when I couldn't get to it, I was having cold sweats. I knew the website would come back up, but it made me realize I have 0 hard copies of all of my recipes. I mean, I have a few here and there that I've printed out in tucked places, but I have over 700 recipes on my website, and I don't have a hard copy of them all. There's no backup. So that is going to be on my agenda here very soon. I gotta get a new printer, because this one I have is not going to cut it. So anyways, back to the recipe. Like I said, this is a yeast bread recipe, and this is kind of a sort of a free-form loaf, in that it's baked on a baking sheet, and it's just kind of a big oval sort of shape. But it's fairly easy to make. I don't think yeast bread should be intimidating, and this is definitely a good one to make. So I'm going to get all of my supplies out, all of my ingredients and everything, and then we'll get started. Alright, so I've got my ingredients here. Let me bring you down here for a second. So right here I've got 1 cup of warm water, and you want it to be about 120 degrees or so. You don't want it to be too awful hot, because if it's too hot, it's going to kill your yeast. So I'm going to add in 2½ teaspoons of instant yeast. I'm going to add in 1/2 teaspoon of sugar. That's just to feed the yeast. Gonna give that a quick stir, and then I'm just going to let this rest for about 10 minutes for the yeast to bloom. If you're not familiar with yeast baking, blooming is when the yeast begins to come to life. It wakes up and it begins to bubble. So we'll just let that sit for a few minutes, and while that is resting, I will measure out my dry ingredients. So a while back I had somebody ask me if I would make bread by hand rather than using a mixer. And I don't remember who it was who asked me that, but they're in luck, because as it turns out, where did I put my... Oh. As it turns out, I have never made this bread in a mixer. So you're going to see me do it by hand today. I'm going to put in 6 cups of bread flour. And while I do make a lot of homemade bread with freshly milled yeast, this is one that I've always done with just normal bread flour. So All right, I gotta count or I'm gonna lose count. 3, 4, 5, and 6. Okay, and to this I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of fine sea salt, and I'm going to add a teaspoon of dry mustard. I'll stir these all together. There's some thunder. All right, so as you can see, my yeast has bloomed. Got that nice bubbling foam there at the top. So now what I'm going to do, and let me bring you in here so you can see. So I'm making a well in the bottom of the flour here, nice and deep. Okay, and I'm going to take my yeast mixture here, and I'm going to pour it down in there. So now I'm just going to take my hand, clean of course, and I'm going to kind of swirl this liquid in the middle, and I'm just going to pull flour from the sides into the liquid, and I'm going to kind of work it with my fingers, break up the clumps, and we're just going to kind of do this for a little bit until we have a slurry here that's about the consistency of pancake batter. So not watery, but not too thick. I think that will about do it. You can see it's kind of thick there. So now I'm going to grab some of this flour off of the side, and I'm just going to kind of sprinkle it. I'm just sprinkling it over the top here just to prevent a skin from forming. Alright, so now I'm going to let this sit for about 20 minutes. So while I'm waiting on my yeast here to do its thing, I washed up my dishes, put those over there, they're drip drying, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank those of you who have been purchasing things from my shop. If you don't know, I have a merch shop with t-shirts and hoodies and things like that, and I noticed that there has been several purchases in that shop recently. I do not have the ability to see who purchased them. I don't know who they are to thank. I can only see what items have been purchased and what country they were shipped to, and so I just wanted to say thank you to those of you, whomever you are. Thank you for purchasing some goodies out of the shop. And speaking of shops, I for quite some time have had a partnership with an artist who has made handmade pottery mugs for me with my hen and spoon logo design, and her business has been doing really well. She actually opened up a physical retail location, and because of that, her business model has changed a little bit, and she's doing things a little bit differently, and she will not be doing the partnerships with YouTube channels like mine in the future. So if you have not already gotten a mug from her website, you aren't going to be able to. So those of you who did get one, you're the lucky ones, because there won't be any more. Now that said, there are coffee mugs in my merch shop, but they're not handmade. They are just like your classic coffee mugs with the print on them. So you can still get a Good Life Farm mug. It just won't be the beautiful pottery ones. All right, so that is about ready. So I'm gonna need one more cup of warm water. And I always filter the water because I don't want, we're on city water here. We don't have a well, unfortunately. And I don't want the chlorine and everything going into my yeast. And so I use filtered water. I heat up a kettle, and then I just use this to get it to the right temperature, because going through my filter has got to be cold water. So that feels about good. So I'm going to pour in the second cup of water. And then I'm just going to begin stirring this with my hand and just pulling in flour from the side until I've got kind of a shaggy, messy dough beginning to form. I'm not going to try and get all of the flour because I'm not necessarily going to need it all. I'm just going to stir it. Now that it's beginning to thicken, I'm just going to kind of turn it over on itself and just continue pulling the flour into the dough. Alright, so we've got kind of a shaggy, messy dough right here. So I'm going to take some of this extra flour that's over here on the side of the bowl, and I'm going to sprinkle it on my surface here. And then I'm going to take my messy dough here. It's kind of in pieces at the moment, but I'm going to get it all out and pile it here on the counter. And then I am going to begin kneading it. So now I'm just going to start kneading, if we can focus in the right spot there. I'm just going to start kneading the dough. And this will take maybe 8 to 10 minutes or so, just to develop a nice, soft, smooth dough. And at first it's going to be super messy, but in a couple minutes it will be lovely. And just add a little extra flour out of the bowl as we need it. Basically, you just want to add enough flour, a little at a time, so that it's not sticking to your hands or to the counter. You don't want to add too much flour, because if you add too much, your bread is going to get tough and hard. You only want just enough. And I probably have the wrong shirt on today to be doing this because of these little strings. I'm gonna have flour all over myself and probably all over the floor, but that's okay. It's just flour. Alright, so basically you're just going to keep doing this until you've got a nice, soft, elastic dough. I am probably I'm going to have to turn some lights on here in a second because it is starting to get dark in here. Got a storm out there, which is kind of quieted down a little bit. Still hearing a little thunder from time to time, but no rain once again. There's some thunder right there. I don't know if you can hear it. I don't know if we're actually going to get anything out of all of this. The garden is definitely struggling. We went from way too much rain to not enough again. Wouldn't you know it? All right, so I think we are about there. This dough is nice and soft and elastic and looking good. So on my website, on the printable version, I instruct the readers to dump out their bowl and wash it and dry it. But for the sake of expediency, I have a clean bowl right here. So we will go ahead and use this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drizzle just a little bit of olive oil into my bowl here. About, I don't know, a tablespoon or so. Kind of swirl that around. Then I'm going to take my bread dough here, and I'm just going to plop it in the bowl. Give it a swirl, and then I'm just going to kind of give it a swirl to coat it. Then I'm going to turn the bread over, the dough over, and swirl it again to coat that side. So the bowl is nice and coated, my dough is nice and coated. Then I'll keep it from drying out, and let me wash my hands. So now I'm just going to grab a tea towel, and I'm going to dampen it, and I'm going to lay it over my bowl here. And this is going to sit on the kitchen counter for about an hour and a half, or until it has doubled in size. And while it is rising, I will be making the onion part and the cheese part for the Swiss onion bread. So the bread dough is almost there. Got just a little bit longer to go. So I'm going to start the next step, which is a good sized onion. So I'm cutting off the end pieces. And then I'm going to very carefully kind of score that and remove the outer skin. Okay. And then I'm just going to cut a few, like maybe 2 or 3 slices off the side of this onion because I want some rings that are complete. Alright, now I'm just going to set these onion rings aside for now. And I'm just going to go ahead and dice up the rest of my onion. Right down here I've got a skillet. I'm going to start heating that up. I'm going to add about a tablespoon of olive oil. And I'm going to add in my diced onions. And I'm just going to cook these on kind of a low heat until they are tender and caramelized. Alright, so hopefully you can hear me alright. Let's see if that will help a little bit. Okay. So my onions are over here, and they are just tender and caramelized, little bits of golden here and there. You'll have to pardon the sizzling back there. I've got dinner going at the same time here. I'm kind of multitasking like I do. And I've got a hunk of Swiss cheese here that I picked up from the Dutch Oven Bakery, which is a Mennonite bakery and deli here in our area. And this is about 3/4 of a pound. This recipe generally uses about 10 ounces of cheese. So close enough. This isn't something that has to be a precise measurement. So I am going to shred about 2/3 of this, I'm going to grate it, and then the rest of it I'm just going to cut into like 1/2-inch chunks. So I'm going to grate my cheese here and keep an eye on dinner over there at the same time. So I've got the shredded cheese, and then I've got this chunk here. And I'm going to go ahead and dice this up into about 1/2-inch or so pieces. Now you could actually just shred the entire thing, but this bread is going to get rolled up like a cinnamon roll. And so what I like to do is when I sprinkle the cheese into or onto the bread when it's patted out, I like to also drop some chunks so that as you are kind of eating your bread, you'll occasionally come into just this nice gooey bit of Swiss cheese. You could, like I said, grate all of it and just do it that way, but I just like this occasional pop of extra Swiss in the bread. So here is my bread dough. Look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? So now I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of flour here on the counter. I'm going to turn the dough out. Okay. And then I'm just going to pat the dough out until it's about 12 inches by 18 inches or so. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just kind of a rectangle. Alright, So now I'm going to take my onions over here. I'll kind of let them cool down a little bit. And I'm going to spread them all over the dough. Alright, then I'm going to take my chunks of the Swiss cheese and I'm just going to kind of randomly place them all over. And you want to go about ½ an inch from the edge for all of these ingredients. You want to kind of leave that space. Alright, so we got the chunks. And then we're going to add about half, well, maybe about 2/3 of the shredded cheese as well. We're going to save some of it. Just sprinkle it all over. So now I'm just going to start at one end and I'm going to roll this up as tightly as I can. And then I'm going to set it on my baking stone right here. Tuck the ends in and let it rise one more time. Alright, we're going to kind of pinch that seam together. And we're going to set this onto my baking stone here, seam side down, and we're going to tuck the ends up underneath when we do that. Just like that. Alright, and then we're going to take our damp tea towel again, cover it back up, and let it rise for 1 more hour. And I'm just going to kind of set it out of the way for now. So in case you are wondering, I will show you what I made for dinner tonight. This is restaurant-style Mongolian beef and broccoli. And it gets served over some rice. Alright, so my bread has been rising and it's actually slightly hanging off the side here a little bit, but it should be fine. So my oven's been heating up to 400 degrees and I've got a little dish of milk right here. I'm just going to brush some milk all over the top of the bread.
I gotta go out here and try to lock these guys up.
Okay, honey. And then I'm going to take the remainder of the Swiss cheese that I have shredded here, and I'm just going to kind of place it down the center of the loaf. Just sprinkle it over the top there. Alright. And then while this goes into the oven and begins baking, Those onion slices that I had cut up earlier are in just a little skillet with some water. And I'm going to bring this up to a boil, let it simmer for about a minute or so, then I'll turn it off and let this cool down. And these will go onto the bread in a little bit. This is going to go in for 20 minutes to begin with. Then the onion slices will get placed on top and then it'll finish baking. And hopefully we don't have a bread loaf explosion with it hanging off the side there like that. So now that's going to bake for another 20 to 25 minutes or until it is beautiful and golden. Now I didn't start making this bread until pretty late, and so it's already dark outside and everything, and as you see I was making dinner. So once this is finished baking, I'm going to slide it out onto a rack to let it cool, and then I will finish up this video in the morning because I want you to see how lovely that loaf is in the sunlight, good light, so you can see how pretty it is, unlike the awful light right now. So I will join you back here again in the morning. Good morning. So it is the next day, as you can guess, and last night when the bread got done baking, I slid it onto a cooling rack, let it cool down, and then I have this big container, food container to store it in. But the loaf was actually so big I had to cut an end off to get it to fit into the container. Yes, but I just wanted to show you this beautiful bread. And let me pull it out of the plastic container and set it on a tray so that it looks pretty for you. Alright, so here is the finished loaf with the end cut off, like I said. But this bread is just so good. And you can see on the end where I've sliced it, you see how we have these little pockets? That's where I had the chunks of the Swiss cheese. And so it looks like an air bubble, but it's completely coated with Swiss cheese. So when you bite into that, it's just chewy and cheesy and just amazing. So that is my Swiss onion bread, and if you would like to make this recipe, if you are into bread baking at all, I highly recommend this. So there is of course a printable version on my website, and I will put a link to that down below where you can print it out or save it however you like to save your recipes. So thanks for joining me here again in the Homestead Kitchen. My name is Constance at A Good Life Farm, and I'll talk to y'all next time.